Welcome to the Startup Sessions, the #1 web show and podcast for trusting your gut, breaking the rules, and starting something meaningful, featuring in-depth interviews with acclaimed creative entrepreneurs that have succeeded at building their own remarkable businesses. My guest today is someone who left all his possessions behind and set out on a journey with just $10 and a laptop. He ended up spending over 1,000 days on the road, visiting all 50 states and helping over 500 people to start meaningful businesses or projects along the way. Greg Hartle is on the show with me today, and he's an entrepreneur. He facilitates workshops and keynotes. He's the CEO and co-founder of a brand new web platform called sitebuilder.io, and he's the chairman and partner of Unmistakable Media, home of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast with Srini Rao and the Instigator Experience live event. This is a fascinating conversation with someone that truly embodies being an example of possibility in the world. And we're going to dive in on imperative topics like finding the balance between taking care of yourself while making a contribution, and figuring out your hypocrisy threshold, as well as how to navigate uncertainty while going through big life changes or starting new endeavors. You'll be inspired and transformed by Greg's practical life and business experience and how you can apply this directly to your new projects and ideas. It's all coming to you right now on episode 43 of The Startup Session. Today I'm speaking with Greg Hartle, a guy who once gave away all of his possessions and set out on a journey to start from scratch with $10 and a laptop, and now inspires others through workshops, keynotes, the Unmistakable Creative Podcast with Srini Rao, and a conference called the Instigator Experience. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Glad to be here. I know you've had some great guests on recently that I know personally, and I'm excited to follow suit.
Okay, perfect. And yes, into that, two of my recent guests, Meg Warden and John Freese, spoke highly of you. You left a tremendous impact on working with them, and I am honored to have you here on the Startup Sessions today. I think a good place to start is to maybe back up a little bit and give the listeners and viewers some perspective, because you went from a seemingly ideal life with a great job, a nice car, all the toys, being in great shape, to being diagnosed with a rare kidney disease. And you spent the next few years, from what I've read, really making a pretty big life transition, burning through your savings and dealing with medical bills and really changing everything about your life. You then went on a journey to all 50 states, helping, I think it was over 500 people, discover more about living a more meaningful life and career. And now you're facilitating workshops, keynotes, you're co-founder of a web platform business. You got a lot going on. And this is such a huge shift between the other version of your life and where you are today, and you once seemingly had so much under control, and then everything shifted. So will you talk a little bit about life before and after that major transition, and what kind of an impact has that had on you?
Boy, that's a deep question. The framework that I would use to make sense of all of that, at least how it's made sense to me, or how I've made sense of it, is I guess the difference between achievement and accomplishment versus contribution. And what I discovered for myself is that, in my early 20s, I was fortunate to have a lot of achievements and accomplishments, even actually in my teens and before that. I've just always been an individual who set out to achieve things and was fortunate enough to have whatever it took, had the right people around me, whatever it was, that I achieved a lot of those things. And so in my early 20s, I had what would be considered a great American life. I had achieved a lot of financial success. I had achieved a lot of business success. I had great friends. I had great toys. I'd done a lot of really good things. I guess the part that was missing was some sort of enduring contribution, because what I discovered is that most achievements have a beginning and an end. And so I feel that oftentimes they leave us actually unfulfilled because they end. And so then it's the next achievement and the next achievement. And it's why we as Americans oftentimes find ourselves in a world of bigger, better, best. Because once one achievement is done, it feels unfulfilling, and then we've got to do another one, and that one's got to be bigger, better, best, our best work each time, which there's nothing wrong with. In many respects, I'm still that same person. I strive to be the best at what I'm doing. I still take on a lot of projects and work and do a lot of things, and I try to achieve a lot of things personally. The difference is, for me, what I found is that it's more fulfilling for me to add a component to that I'm also making a contribution at the same time. Because what I've discovered is that when I can make that contribution at the same time, there's some sort of enduring quality to it, and there's something that lasts within me, and there's something that lasts within that project or that business that I'm working on, and there's something that impacts others and not just me. And I found that to be a much more fulfilling and meaningful way to live. And so I guess if you had to, your question about pre and post having medical challenges, that was the thing that I discovered about myself, was that on the one hand, achievement and accomplishment is great. On the other, it usually has a beginning and an end, and leaves us less fulfilled. And so if there's an element that we can add that in addition to that makes a contribution, I find that that's often enduring and ongoing and outlives us in many respects even.
Okay, that's fantastic. I love that. I think that's, now that we're speaking about contribution, even as I think about, my reason for stepping away from the corporate world, I would say that contribution is more and more a driving force behind that for me. Was contribution something that evolved for you over time? Was that something that was in the forefront of your mind when you decided to take off on your journey to all 50 states? How did contribution evolve for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess where I started is in the discovery that likely the best contribution each of us can make, at least in the research that I've done and my personal experience and talking to so many others, is to be an example of possibility. Because it's through examples of possibility that other people have the opportunity to see themselves in a way that they didn't see themselves before. And when they have that opportunity, they tend to behave differently. And when they behave differently, they tend to make different decisions and different choices when they're faced with certain choices. And so for me, the first step is just to simply be the best example of possibility that I could be in whatever area it might have been. And that's the thing about contribution, is it doesn't have to be this huge contribution. If you're gifted enough or talented enough or fortunate enough to make some huge contribution, that's great. If you somehow can donate the money to build a medical clinic that helps cure cancer or something that's significant, or you're able to travel to a country that is maybe has conditions that need to be improved, and you can make that kind of major contribution, or you invent a product like the printing press that changes everything. That's obviously a certain level of contribution. But what I discovered is really it's just about being an example of possibility. So it's about choosing certain areas of your life and saying to yourself, I can be an example of possibility in these areas. And it's less overwhelming that way, at least it was for me, and it's more of an opportunity to figure out myself and how I can make that contribution. And you mentioned the project that I did, $10 in the laptop, where I traveled to all 50 states. That was certainly part of it. That's a great example of where there were many personal achievements within that project, one being to get to all 50 states, starting with a $10 bill. And that was a personal achievement that I wanted to achieve for very personal reasons. But in addition to that, I made an effort to work with, my goal was 500, which ended up being 536 other aspiring entrepreneurs to help them launch their businesses and get it off the ground. That was my contribution, because I knew that if I could do that, it would create the ripple effect, and they would go off and do what they wanted to do. And I knew that if I started with little resources, I could demonstrate to them as an example of possibility that whatever resources you currently have are enough. They may not be enough to get you where you ultimately want to go, but to get started, they're enough. And here I'll show you, I'll demonstrate, and hopefully that will be an example of possibility to you. you'll look at that and you'll say, I can do that too, or I can do something similar to that, not necessarily exactly what I did, but whatever your opportunity is to use the resources you have. And then you go off and you create a ripple effect for other people by being your own example of possibility. And that was really the intent behind that project.
Okay. That's fascinating. It's in some ways almost opposite of what many entrepreneurs or people wanting to start something approach things from. I find that a lot of people approach things from the aspect of how can I immediately make a certain amount of money or raise a certain amount of capital or, things of that nature, which inherently aren't bad. But I love that being an example of possibility for me really engages me to look a little deeper within myself and see how I can impact someone else at a deeper level. That's just how it strikes me. So I really love that.
Yeah, and I do think, though, you're making a good point, because I think there's often this, there's this harmony between how do you make sure you're taking care of yourself and your needs, and then how can you assist others. And so that's actually why I like the idea of it being an example of possibility. So my first and foremost, the idea behind that project was to take care of myself. It wasn't like on day one I was immediately helping other people. I couldn't, because I didn't have the resources that I needed. I didn't have everything that I needed to make sure I was okay on day one. I had to use the resources that I had to get myself in a position where I was okay enough to then help other people. And so I think that's an important element there, a distinction. Wherever you're at, it's not as if you have to say to yourself, I'm really struggling, gosh, I have to help a bunch of other people. It's really to say, I want to be an example of possibility. What do I need to change about my life, my circumstances, my conditions, my scenario, my attitude, whatever it might be, so that I am an example of possibility to other people.
Okay, that's great. And that's, for most people, I would guess, that's a process. That's not something where you snap your fingers and overnight you're stuck in a corporate job that you don't enjoy one day and the next day you're off changing the world. At least that's not the way it works for most people. So I think it is important to understand that process, and that's you put in place that foundation to make a difference for other people and be that example of possibility more and more and more every day. Very cool.
Absolutely.
All right. So one of the things that this has certainly been a frustration for myself quite recently, and with many of my clients. We're looking to make change and looking to do more meaningful work in a way that feels more aligned with who we are. And, oftentimes I think that comes about over time, or maybe because of an event like you had. Yours was pretty severe. But people are wanting, I think, more than ever to embrace the possibility of technology, of just everything we're surrounded with and by to make a difference. What is your, this is a bit broad, but what is your suggestion for people that want to embrace more creativity in their lives to begin taking steps towards being an example of possibility and also of, sustaining themselves financially as they go along?
I'll give you three levels to that, or how I would see it is, on one level, and this is something that I've been doing a lot of research on, and I'm not sure I can officially articulate it quite yet, but I'm going to try to give you an idea and some examples here.
Okay.
I believe that inside of each of us, we have a certain hypocrisy threshold. And what I mean by that is that we live in a world in which we're constantly told how we should live and what we should do and what we should buy and who we should be. And what we have to decide is how much of that we actually believe and support and will follow, and how much of that we will go against. And it's very hard to figure out where that line is. It's very hard. It's very hard to know, should I keep this career job and hopefully end up with money left over and retire with a 401k and be safe and take care of my family, versus try to go after something that I want to attempt to go after, and what if that just totally bombs and fails? And, it's very hard to figure out where that line is. And it's very hard to figure out what we're willing to kind of feel a little bit like a hypocrite about. And that's really an uncomfortable place to be and an uncomfortable feeling, but all of us have to experience that. It's why the artist doesn't know if they should sell their stuff in a capitalist world or just make art, and, the whole starving artist thing. And, it's this constant game inside of our head of what are we willing to be a little bit of a hypocrite about? And, I use some examples sometimes that I don't know if they're quite great examples or not, but they kind of show up for me anyway. I recently read an article about Richard Branson talking about how he went vegan, and he went vegan specifically because it was better for the environment. And then I thought to myself, don't you have 100 different planes up in the air, which is one of the things that's actually destroying the environment more than anything else, right? But he has to decide within himself, where is that hypocrisy threshold for himself? And all of us experience that. Every single one. Is he right? Is he wrong? I don't know. He doesn't know. None of us know, right? We just do the best that we can. And so I think on one fundamental level, it's actually looking at the big picture and asking yourself, honestly, what am I willing to be a little bit of a hypocrite about? What am I willing to kind of buck the system about, yet knowing that I'm kind of not bucking the system over here? And, it's figuring that line out for yourself. That's not easy to do. It's a lot of exploration and a lot of, just uncovering, testing that line and seeing where you're at. I mean, the same thing I saw with Jay-Z, where Jay-Z used to, he built his career talking about, how he grew up on the streets and, the struggle and all that. And then, he makes clothing that he puts in Barney's that, people that he grew up with could never possibly buy. They don't have the money to buy that kind of stuff. It's like, where do you draw that line, and where is that line for you? None of us know. We have to do the best we can, and we have to take advantage of the opportunities that are provided to us each individually. So on one level, it's figuring out being okay with being a hypocrite on some level. I think that's actually very important and something that I am doing a lot of research on. On the second level, I would say it's a very emotional thing. Change is an external exercise. Transition is an internal response to that change. So if you lose your job, that's the external change that happens. If you graduate college and enter the working world, that's the external change that happens. If you get a divorce, if you start a new job at a new place, if you open a new business, that's the change that occurs. What most of us do is we try to figure out how to handle that change. We try to figure out the systems and approaches about handling that change, which can be useful. What most of us don't do, which I've found to be much more effective, is how do we handle the internal transition that we're personally experiencing as a result of that change? Because if we can get better at handling the internal transition that we're going through that change, we will adjust and adapt much better. We will have less anxiety, less stress, less pressure on us. We will make better decisions, sound, educated guesses. We will tend to like ourselves better and the others around us. We will feel less stress, and we will feel better about what we're doing. So we have to figure out how to manage that internal transition that we're going through. Now, typically that happens through 3 phases. You have to go through the ending of something previous, which most of us don't do. So we experience a change where something, quote unquote, ended, but we actually internally don't experience the end of that. We go through a divorce, but we hang on all to the bitterness and everything else associated with that previous relationship, and we transfer that forward to our current relationships. We get laid off from our job, and we hate everyone in corporate America, even though that was an individual experience that we had in that specific scenario, which makes it very hard for us to go out and get a new job in corporate America. So what we tend to do is we tend to not truly end the previous experience. And because of that, we never bring closure to it to open up a whole new world to us. And we make all our decisions and judgments based on that previous experience. We carry that forward into our judgments and decisions going forward, and then we tend to make the same decisions or poor decisions, or we tend to do things that cause us more stress or lead to more anxiety. So number one is we have to end that. We officially have to decide that phase of our life is over, which is very hard to do in a world in which we often have an identity associated with whatever it was we were doing, right? Mm-hmm. We are a father, we are a husband, we are a mechanic, we are a computer programmer. We define our lives by our identity of what we are and what we do. And so when something ends, that's why we don't really want to end it. Because what we're really doing is we're having to end that identity and start a new identity. And that's a really difficult thing to go through. So I would say first we have to end that thing. Second, this is the really tough part. That's not even the tough part, and that's really tough. The second thing is we have to go through a phase of ambiguity. Because before a new thing can show up, there's this phase of we don't know. And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in this phase of we don't know. And so what happens is we're holding on tight to that old thing because we don't want to let that identity go. We're also holding on tight because all we see in front of us is just a wide open space with nothing at the other end of that. And nothing at the other end of that is worse than the worst thing at the other end of that. Because at least with the worst thing at the other end of that, we know the outcome, right? And so when we know the outcome, even if it's bad, we actually prefer that over the unknown. Because the unknown, we can't fathom what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So what we do is we hang on tight to the old, and then we enter into this phase of ambiguity, and we can't handle the ambiguity. So what we have to do is we have to put in systems and structures to go through a temporary circumstance. So when you lose your job, you don't immediately have another one typically the next day. And so what you have to do is you have to put up systems and structures to make sure you don't fall into this gap of total unknownness, and where you start to lose your mind about things. You start to question and what if, and I should have, and could have, and would have, and should have, and you play that game with yourself. So you have to put up temporary structures to make sure you get through that. Watching a show like this is a perfect example. If you have a job, there's nothing wrong. In fact, there's a lot of right with watching a show like this because it helps you with that gap of ambiguity in the middle. It helps you process information, think about ideas, do things differently, look at your life differently without first taking the leap. And that's very beneficial. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, at the other end is a new beginning. And it's that new beginning that we're all after, and a lot of us just don't know what that new beginning is. And so we want to take on this idea of embracing these new technologies and these new ways of working and finding meaningful work. But we don't know how to let go of the old thing, and we don't want to be in that phase of ambiguity. Yet both are absolutely required for that new thing to show up, whatever it might be. And so we have to go through those two phases to get to that last phase, which is to do what you really want to do with your life.
Mm. Wow. That is a tremendous download of brilliance.
I told you that was a deep question.
That's fantastic. I had never really thought it through or heard it described quite like that. And yet, as you're sitting there talking about, this transition, this internal transition, I'm thinking through the different things in my life that I've, held on to and brought forward that have kind of sabotaged that new beginning in many ways. Yep. And so it's so true. Gosh, thank you for sharing that. That's just
absolutely.
That in and of itself is just a huge, incredible amount of wisdom that was just dropped on me and the listeners as well.
Thanks.
Wow. Thank you for that. One of the things that tends to come up, Greg, a lot with the people that I speak with, I would call many of them creative entrepreneurs, is kind of the art of developing creativity, or even the discussion around you're either creative or you're not. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I've heard you speak a little bit about, is that creativity and developing that creative muscle. I know that's something that a lot of viewers of this show and listeners of this show are constantly wanting to know about, is how to develop that creativity muscle. What insight would you have about doing that?
Well, that's a great question, because I think we have perpetuated this myth that two things. One, you're either born with it or you're not. Mm-hmm. And the second is that somehow it just comes down from the sky and strikes you in that moment, and all of a sudden you're creative, right? And you have this genius idea. In reality, what's actually often taking place there is, connecting dots or problem solving. So the places I like to begin when I'm thinking about being creative is, number one, you have to eliminate distractions. Because if you never allow the space for creativity, it's never going to show up. And in the world in which we're constantly bombarded by everything, it's hard to find the space to even think clearly enough to have any sort of creativity. And so you have to figure out how do you eliminate or reduce the distractions in your life. And so as much as creativity is this free-flowing thing that just kind of naturally happens, it's also the result of a lot of structure and constraints. So most creativity, if you actually look at it, it comes from structure and constraints. So one is figuring out the structure or environment that you need so that you actually have the space to be creative. Two is to begin to put those constraints on yourself, because most of us live in a world in which we don't have to worry about constraints as much. You know, we have air conditioning and televisions, and we have vehicles and modes of transportation. So we don't have to get creative in our everyday lives. But if I told you you had to get water today and you couldn't get it out of the tap or the refrigerator and you couldn't buy it down the street, you'd start getting pretty damn creative pretty fast on how to get water, right? And so you have to figure out how to put constraints in place. So you look at the $10 in the laptop project, and a big part of that was intentionally putting constraints in place for me so that I would be more creative and I would experience more things in life. Because once you put those constraints on yourself, you start to open up channels inside yourself and inside your brain that you start to look for things and connect dots that you weren't connecting before. So you use your past experiences, the current resources that are right in front of you, and you start to connect dots that you didn't see, that didn't exist before, because you didn't have any constraints that allowed you to see them, that forced you to see them in many ways. And the third piece of that, in addition to the constraints, is really to problem solve. You know, everyone always asks me, I often hear people talk about starting businesses for very personal reasons. You know, I say, why'd you start that business? And most of the time I get answers like, I wanted financial freedom, I wanted the ability to work from home, you know, I wanted to make $1 million, whatever it might be, right? But if you actually look at the businesses that do very well, they're usually because somebody had a problem that they decided to solve. And so I always ask myself, what frustrates me? What bothers me? What pisses me off? Mm-hmm. It's from there that I get my best ideas, and I start to get very creative about how to solve them, especially if I then add that component of constraints around them. So I'll give you a simple example. You know, I was at the DMV the other day, and I was talking to my business partner, Brad, with sitebuilder.io. And it's a web development platform. You can develop your own website through the platform, and you can do it within minutes. And so we played a game, and I said, what will happen faster? Will I be able to use my iPhone, create a website, and sell my first product before they call me to the front of the line of the DMV? Right? So if you want to be creative, play games like that. Try to solve a problem. The problem was, could I make more money than I'm about to spend at the DMV within the time I'm at the DMV? And could I do it with only my cell phone? Right? So start to play that game. Put those constraints on yourself. Yeah. Put yourself in that position. And then you're kind of forced into, I don't know, let's figure this out. Let's see how we can do this. Mm-hmm. And let's see what we can come up with. So there's some ways to get the creative juices flowing into practice. Solve problems. Go around looking at things and saying, man, that really pisses me off, or that bothers me, or I wish that wasn't that way. And then start figuring out how you can solve it.
Yeah.
Even if you're not going to turn that into your own business, it's a great exercise for creativity.
Sure. And that's, you know, those exercises spill over into, you know, the actual, you know, work in your business or whatever you're trying to accomplish. Yeah. So who won the bet at the DMV?
Well, it was kind of a wash, because we ended up having some coding errors that didn't allow, because we're in beta, we're actually in alpha right now, so we actually haven't released it to the public yet. Yeah. And so I was testing it out, and we ran into some errors, and so we had to start over. So we're going to test it again.
Okay, I love it. All right, cool. Fantastic. Well, this is so much good stuff, Greg. A couple of things. I want to have you speak about some of the things that you're excited about and you're currently doing. And I know that I'm going to have people wanting to know and asking the question, if we don't provide it, like how to get in touch with you and learn more about a lot of this stuff that you're sharing. So why don't we just go there right now? And then I want to end with a lightning round of questions. But yeah, just give the listeners and viewers the best place to reach you, or places to reach you, to find out more about what you're offering and how they can learn more about what Greg Hartle's doing right now.
Yeah, I would say the easiest place to find anything about me is greghartle.com.
Okay.
And also you can follow me on Twitter at Greg Hartle. Okay. In addition to that, I'll just mention a couple of things if you're looking for things specifically. So one thing is I've recently became the founder in residence at Startups here in Portland, Oregon, which Startups is, as you interviewed John Freese, the co-founder of Startups. It's an accelerator peer-to-peer mentorship for founders of startups. And so my job is to simply just actually literally sit there all day long and talk to people about their ideas and their businesses and what they're doing. So if you're local to Portland, come on into Starbucks, and I'm happy to sit down and chat about your ideas or what you're up to. I would say, secondly to that, if you're interested in an additional podcast to your podcast, we have our own at the Unmistakable Creative. So if you go to unmistakablecreative.com, we interview a lot of interesting people and creative entrepreneurs about what they're up to and what they've experienced, and that's always, and like I said earlier, I think it's always beneficial to be listening to other examples of possibility. Yeah. That's one of the best ways that I make progress myself. And then I would say the third, sitebuilder.io is not live yet, but if you're interested in a beta test of a site that you can build on your own, if you have products to sell, a business that you're running, and you want a better, more optimized website that you want to control on your own, and you can always send us a message through there, sitebuilder.io, and of course, I'm happy to set you up with a beta version once we go live. Great. So there's a couple of ways that people can get in touch with me. Okay, perfect.
Thanks a lot, Greg. And I'll link up all of those that you just mentioned at thestartupsessions.com/episodes/43. Great. All right. Let's wrap this up with a lightning round of questions for you. Sound good?
Sure.
All right.
Sure.
What's the most influential book lately for you?
Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, I would say, definitely, because it's a great book about how we actually make decisions and whether or not we're making decisions on sound evidence or not.
Okay, great. Best conference or industry event and why?
Not my own, because I have the Instigator experience.
Actually,
which is my own
let's
event,
talk.
so.
A lot of people do talk about their own, and I love it. I think it's a chance for people to hear about new conferences and events. So, absolutely.
So we have an event called the Instigator Experience, and you can go to theinstigatorexperience.com if you want to learn more. Mm-hmm. But basically, it's part of Unmistakable Media, our digital media company that runs our podcasts, Unmistakable Creative. And it's an event we put on once a year in Los Angeles, typically in April. We've only had one. We had one last year. This will be our second year. The idea is to help people that have bold ideas, not necessarily businesses, but it might be nonprofits, it might be just a product, whatever it might be. They have bold ideas, but they're not sure how to get them off the ground. So the entire event is built on, it's a 2-day event, built on how to get that idea up off the ground and hopefully get it off the ground while you're there, if at all possible. And then what we do is we bring in somewhere between 8 and 10 of our guests of our show to come in and talk to you about specific topics, just inspire you to do good work and to really make that decision, that bold decision to get your idea off the ground. So we have that event, the Instigator Experience. I would say in addition to that, a good friend of mine, AJ Leon, runs an event called Misfit Conference, and that's up in Fargo, North Dakota. I like that event because it's totally, oddball up in Fargo. Nobody, goes to Fargo typically, but it's this great little event with a lot of very interesting people to meet. And I'm always of the ilk, we talked about creativity. One of the best ways that you can help with creativity is to meet people from various industries, from various walks of life, and learn from them. Yeah. So at that event, there's a lot of people that are way outside the box, not necessarily anything to do with business, but it'll help you in your business. So I would recommend that one as well. Okay, great. Thank you. Most effective strategy for growing your business? Act, just constant action. I always say the best entrepreneurs have a bias toward action. And I like to use the phrase act, analyze, adjust. Just constant motion, analyze it, make adjustments. Great. Love that. Favorite business tool or resource? Other than my MacBook, because everything is in my MacBook. I'm a big fan of Evernote. Definitely use Evernote all the time for pretty much everything. Okay, great. All right. And then finally, what's the most recent exciting adventure that you've been a part of, and or your favorite hobby, or any combination of those things? Well, I'm a big fan of parkour, so I used to do a lot of parkour, not so much anymore.
Okay.
As far as an adventure, I mean, I just finished 3 straight years, over 1,000 straight days on the road, traveling the entire United States, visiting all 50 states. That was quite the adventure. I don't need any more adventures for a while after that one.
That's quite the adventure.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right, Greg, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate your insight, your wisdom around life, around business, around creativity. So many good things that you mentioned, and I encourage listeners and viewers to dig in more. Go to greghartle.com and check out what he's doing and what he has to offer. And I just learned at the start of the show that Greg's in Portland. So, Greg, I look forward to getting to know you, hopefully a little bit more on a more personal level.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to be a part of this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. We'll see and hear everyone next week on a brand new episode of the Startup Sessions. Take care. Bye-bye. I love being challenged to see things from a new perspective, and that's exactly what Greg did for me in this episode. Whether you're just contemplating changing life up a bit, or you're in full swing with some great project or business, what Greg offered today was absolutely invaluable. I think it's so important to start thinking about the contribution we want to make through our work. After all, time passes quickly, and we might as well be doing something that makes an impact. And I'm still reeling from Greg's question about figuring out my hypocrisy threshold. It never occurred to me that I could be completely conscious about choosing the things that I'm a hypocrite about and deciding to be okay with that. Such a powerful realization. And understanding the significance of bringing closure to previous experiences and learning how to navigate the unknown outcomes that lie before us is just plain brilliance. I want to thank Greg for his leading edge thinking about the things that are at the forefront for anyone that's making change happen in their lives and in their businesses. Thanks for listening. Have a great week and live bravely. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to head on over to thestartupsessions.com for a full recap of all our episodes, including links to amazing resources for each guest, thoughtful and provoking blog articles, and many other great resources. Thank you so much for listening and watching. And if today's guest can create a meaningful business and achieve a life of freedom through a business with soul, why can't you?